across the street from Honeycrisp, it's something else. It's supposed to be shelf stable for 2 years.
I'm a little nervous about people.
Since I
offering
hate
me
apples.
No, just kidding.
I'm not offering, I'm eating.
Shelf stable for 2 years. I don't like apples, so that actually would work for me because I would just leave them. They would be like-
Yeah.
I like them cooked with cinnamon and
I like them when somebody
Here in a couple weeks too.
puts them in
Coming
blue
up, March 8th.
for me.
and put some caramel sauce or peanut butter.
Don't need any of that.
Okay, let's call this meeting to order. Notice of an open work session of the City Council of the City of North Kansas City, Missouri, February 18th, 2020. Eric?
Thanks, sir. Tonight's work session is on the KCATA's, Kansas City Area Transportation Authority's North Oak Corridor Transit Study. They do have a presentation to make regarding the results and recommendations coming out of that. So with that, I will turn things over to Sean Straight of Ride KC, KCATA.
There we go. Hello. Sean Straight. I'm the planning manager with KCATA, or Ride KC. I have Don Bolin with me as well, here for to support me on this, so I appreciate it, Don. So wanted to take some time to walk through the results of the North Oak transit study that we completed last year in coordination with North Kansas City, Gladstone, and Kansas City, Missouri. Essentially, want to report on the results of that study and also get into some discussion in terms of reasonable next steps of moving that forward in kind of a more incremental fashion. And then talk a little bit about our Ride KC Next process, which is a system redesign that we just made public last week, and want to kind of walk through some of the high-level concepts of that. So a little bit about the existing service that we operate in the city. So there are currently 5 routes that go through North Kansas City. 4 of those are covered in the contract between North Kansas City and KCATA. So the city pays for a share of these routes based on the hours and mileage of those routes that operate within the city. The exception to that is the 201 North Oak route. That's a route that comes through the city on Burlington. It's the route with the most amount of service of the routes on this list and the route with the most amount of ridership. And our transit study focused on the expansion of that particular route. The route it currently exists, operates 30 minutes during peak periods and then 60 minutes during the midday and evening and on weekends. Operates from fairly early in the evening to late at night. Essentially from Boardwalk Square near 152 Highway and I-29 and downtown, traveling on Berry Road, North Oak, and Burlington.
Is the 201, is that included in our contract?
No, it is
No,
not.
it
This
is
is the one route that is not.
Okay.
Yep. So mention quickly that we do have a regional long-term transit vision that we consult when we do corridor projects like this. North Oak, among other corridors, was identified as one of the key regional pieces to this plan to pursue fast and frequent network service. So essentially wanting to upgrade our service on these primary corridors to at least where buses run every 15 minutes or better all day. And also develop a system of mobility hubs that provide connections between routes and also between our services and other flexible services and Ubers and Lyfts and things like that as well. So the planning process that we conducted for the North Oak study this lasted from about the fall of 2018 to summer 2019 was kind of the span that we completed the study. Public outreach, we had a number of pop-up meetings at community centers. We had one at the YMCA here in North Kansas City, Gladstone Community Center. Also went to a handful of neighborhoods in the area, or I'm sorry, a couple of grocery stores within the area just to have a table near the entrance and talk to people as they come in and out of the grocery store. We found that that's really a great way to go to where people are and actually get a lot more comments than you would get at a traditional public meeting. We had a community survey that we had people fill out. I believe we had 300 some odd responses to that survey that gave us some direction in terms of the type of service that people want to see on the corridor and how they see it being most useful. We did hold an open house public meeting at the end of the project to kind of show the results of the study and get feedback on the final product. Of course, a lot of technical analysis, transit community data went into this process as well. So we ended up with a final set of conclusions on the service design based on a number of alternatives that we reviewed in terms of the endpoints of the route, which ones make the most sense, the frequency of the route that makes the most sense, and so looking at all those different factors and came up with a final conclusion. The implementation and funding plan. So I'll get into this into more detail, but we do have a final recommended plan and a cost for that plan, and then want to get into some of the specifics of how we think we could move it forward. And then, of course, presentations to city councils, and we've been working with the Northland Chamber in this process as well. Just a couple images documenting the planning process, one of the pop-up workshops that we did, and then a map showing some of the different alternatives that we explored on the corridor, looking at basically 7 different options within the Northland to end the route, and then 3 within downtown, and essentially ended up with points A and A on here. So essentially running the route as it runs now, except wanting to upgrade the amount of service on the route. So this is essentially the conclusion that we ended up with in the study. So again, it would remain on the alignment that it currently runs on Burlington through North Kansas City, and then North Oak and Berry Road. Buses would run every 15 minutes up to Berry Road, up to about Berry Road and 169 Highway. From that point on, the service would continue every 30 minutes to Berry Road. So essentially every other bus would continue on Berry Road to our Boardwalk Square Transit Center. So it ends up being doubling, actually a little more than doubling the total amount of service on the corridor. And then also consolidating and improving bus stops. So one of the things we heard in our community input process was that it's important for the route to be faster than it is now. There are a lot of areas where there are stops basically every block, and that really slows down the route. So wanting to consolidate our stops, and it also gives us an opportunity to improve a lot of those stops. When you have fewer of them, more people can congregate at each stop, and you can justify the expense of improving your key locations. So we actually have 2 different types of stop improvements that we're showing on here. One would be more of a max level station, a bus rapid transit level station, and I have a couple images of those here in a minute. And then other proposed stops that would receive a more basic level of improvement, but including ADA upgrades and things like that as well. So just a few examples of what I mean by enhanced transit stations. So these are images of our most recent, the top 3 images are the most recent MAX shelters that we've just recently completed on the Prospect Corridor in South Kansas City. And then the one on the top right is showing 12th and Grand, which is a similar type of model, but for a more kind of streamlined location where you don't have as much right-of-way. And then the 2 at the bottom show some existing stops that we have in downtown Gladstone. So these are some examples of what we mean by enhanced stations. It doesn't necessarily mean this is the exact design that we're prescribing here. We'll want to do some more planning and engineering to better identify what those can look like. But in terms of the scale and type of improvements, this is sort of what we have in mind. So getting into the costs of the project. So we have capital costs and operating costs. So the table here spells out a kind of a low and high scenario here. And so we're in the kind of $23 million to $26 million range total on the corridor. We did not, as a part of this study, include the pedestrian and bicycle enhancements as part of our cost estimate because of other projects going on. You guys are already planning on doing some work on Burlington. Casey Mo and Gladstone have a planning process going on their portion of the corridor that's going to define pedestrian improvements, and we didn't want to make any assumptions there. So we do anticipate a future project including that sort of thing, but didn't want to make those assumptions with this plan, given those other projects that are going on. An example of what this looks like on a by city basis. So essentially, on this table here, we show the 3 cities with the total capital cost, North Kansas City being $4.13 million. Now we have an existing committed $2.42 million, which is essentially crediting the city for the work that you're planning on Burlington already completing, with a remainder of about $1.71 million. And again, these are rough estimates at this point. So here's an example of what it would look like if we were to pursue a federal grant for funding these improvements, which we would like to pursue. We haven't necessarily settled on the right grant or the right time frame, but showing an example of what that could look like, utilizing federal money, so where you end up with a smaller local share. And in this particular scenario, you end up with about a $12 million local share, so federal grants are paying for about half of it, and then the local share to Gladstone, or I'm sorry, to North Kansas City being about $1.9 million. And again, still broad, still for illustrative purposes only at this point. So the operating cost part of this is something we can nail down a little more specifically, because they're known costs and they're costs that we currently incur with our existing service. So the annual operating cost for the total corridor as a whole is about $3.5 million. Based on the hours and mileage of the route, we estimate about $250,000 being the North Kansas City portion of that. So essentially, if you were to take the total cost of the route, take just the hours and miles that are within North Kansas City, and then half of that, because that's what the contract's currently based on. You're paying for half of the miles and hours that are in the city. That's a enclave cities portion of the contract. This is what you would end up with in terms of the total operating cost. A few notes of project justification, just why are we doing this? Why do we think this project would be useful for the city? We think there's a big opportunity for increased ridership. This route shows similar characteristics to the Main Street Max in terms of kind of the demographic makeup and even some of the ridership characteristics. Even though it doesn't have as much ridership as the Main Street Max, we think it has the potential to grow into something close to that. But one key feature of the route is that, at some point in the distant past, it was more of a commuter route, people traveling from the Northland into downtown. That still happens, of course, but it's actually a fairly balanced route in terms of people traveling in both directions. So there's really good opportunity for ridership growth there. The capital investment ends up being about $2 million per mile, which we think is appropriate for the level of expected ridership on the corridor. There are economic development factors here, and we think as you expand service and have more buses on a corridor, it gives you more opportunity for transit-oriented development and development that actually enables people to access our services, more of the max level experience. Consistency with local plans, the numerous planning projects that you guys have completed, and your plans for improvements on Burlington as well. We obviously have to be consistent with those. Public input survey results. There's also a public safety component to this. We've seen on our TruceMax, for example, the first year that route operated, we saw a crime reduction of about 23%. A lot of that has to do with the improved amenities, the better lighting, the better visibility, and more people on the street. And we think there's a big quality of life benefit. We're giving people more opportunities, more transportation options to be able to get to where they need to go. This graph here shows one of our survey questions where we asked people what are the current barriers to public transportation in the North Oak corridor, and then a kind of an assessment of how well we think our plan matches those or meets those comments. The max on North Oak would reduce overall running time, would make the route faster. That was a big comment. That was the number one reason why people said they don't currently ride the service. It would increase frequency and expand service. It may allow us to prioritize the route in terms of reliability and signal priority and things like that. So those are some ongoing discussions that could happen. Reduce concerns with enhanced placemaking and lighting. So essentially, the safety component, adding lighting, adding visibility for those safety improvements, and then improve the quality of bus stops, making the stops more accessible to the surrounding neighborhoods. So this is the point where I kind of want to step back, and I threw some big numbers out and kind of talk about how we can realistically move forward, or at least kind of our initial thinking of how we think we could move this project forward in the near term. We do still have some technical work that will need to be completed on the corridor. Advanced planning, engineering and design, environmental review will have to happen to pursue any sort of federal funding on the project, and then continued coordination with other projects, the Burlington plans that you guys have, but also the Planning Sustainable Places project that the Casey Mo and Gladstone have as well. A local funding assessment, so a kind of more detailed discussion with each of the cities in terms of what can realistically be contributed to the capital and operating side of this to get a better handle on how we can move forward with the project. And then looking in more detail at grant opportunities. We mentioned the BUILD grant earlier. There's the FTA Small Starts program, there's Surface Transportation program, so there's some different options there, and we need to kind of strategize as to which one we think makes the most sense, and we'd have the most realistic chance of being able to get some funding. We would essentially like to propose a phased implementation approach, and getting into the details of that here, essentially wanting to pursue a smaller scale plan than the full plan recommendations. So the full plan recommendations are still the goal. They're still what we want to accomplish. We still think that amount of service is reasonable and useful for the corridor, but recognizing, you know, the $250,000 and the $26 million capital price tag is a lot. So how do we move forward with kind of a smaller incremental step? For the capital improvement side, we would look at the key bus stop locations. So we would pick the 5 or 10 really key locations and really focus on improving those. Look at bus priority treatments like transit signal priority. Can we work with the cities? Can we work with MoDOT on implementing that on the corridor to actually help speed up the route? And then look at possible funding options. STP, Surface Transportation Program, is a possibility for that. And there's actually a call for projects with the Mid-America Regional Council this summer for that particular program. On the service side of things, rather than jump to the 15-minute service, we think that there's a logical step to pursue every 30-minute service. So right now the route operates 30 minutes, but only during the rush hours. It's every hour during the midday and weekends. So we want to upgrade that to every 30 minutes all day. So sort of taking a half step toward the full plan at a more reasonable cost to the cities. That would, of course, require funding from Gladstone and North Kansas City to operate the operating costs. Neither city currently pays for any portion of the 201 route, so we would need some contribution for that. At some later date, we can talk more detail of what those numbers could look like. There are some options for funding. They're much more limited for operating than they are for capital. Really, the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program, the CMAQ program, is really kind of the one major option for that, for new and expanded services. Now, there are some limitations there, in that you can generally only fund a new service for 3 years, at which point you have to come up with the funding on your own. So you do kind of have to have a long-term plan for how you make that sustainable. But it is an option that we could look at. One important thing that I'll note, and I'll get into our system redesign here in a minute, but that particular project actually identified this as a real need and a real opportunity. Our redesign is a cost-neutral program, so this particular improvement wasn't able to be on that, but we had our consultant team look at the next 3 or 4 high priorities in terms of if and when we have additional funding, these are the things you should do, and expanding service on North Oak was one of those things.
Who pays for the 201 now? Is it Kansas City?
Kansas City, yes.
Okay.
Why is that? Why don't we contribute to that? Why haven't we, and why doesn't Gladstone?
I can't really tell you the history behind that and why those decisions were made. You do pay for the other routes that operate within the city. I think part of the thinking is for the so-called enclave cities within KCMO is that this route would need to operate regardless of Gladstone or North Kansas City paying for it, because you're connecting downtown with other parts of KCMO north of Gladstone. And so I think that was part of the thinking with that. So a few slides on Ride KC next, and then I'll answer any questions on this or North Oak. So this is an ongoing project. It's a comprehensive redesign of the transit system, really focused primarily on Kansas City, Missouri, being our primary funder, being the only city that actually has a dedicated revenue source that funds transit, but obviously impacting North Kansas City and other cities in the region as well. Pursuing the system redesign to essentially improve access to opportunity, improve ridership, improve opportunities for development to exist on transit corridors. It's difficult for transit to attract development when the bus only runs once an hour or only peak hours. But when you have buses running every 15 minutes, it really increases the potential for development on that corridor. And also improving connections with other mobility options. So not just focusing on the fixed route system, but also on our flex routes, and even connections to bike share and scooters and things like that as well. And also keeping in mind our long-term vision. So understanding our Smart Moves 3.0 long-term vision is very much out there in terms of cost. It's still our guiding principle and still our goal of where we want to move to as a region. So making sure that we're taking a step in that direction. This is a plan that's about the network. It's about how often buses run and where they run. Where can transit serve the people more usefully? Is there service here where ridership's very low and those buses could be allocated over here where you actually have more potential? The timeline of this process, we're sort of in phase 2. Phase 1, which was a public engagement period where we had a survey out there for a couple of months where we basically asked people to give us their guiding principles in terms of transit service and kind of outlining the choice between ridership and coverage. The ridership model being you take all your buses and you basically assign them to your major corridors and you run them as often as possible. That tends to be the transit model that attracts the most ridership. The competing option is the coverage model, and that's where you take all your buses and you serve every corner of the city. The downside of that is that all those routes end up being very low service routes with buses only once an hour, and you're not generally able to attract much ridership, but you do cover the whole city. Everybody has an option. So essentially our phase 1 asked people to kind of tell us, choose between those models and what's the appropriate percentage between those two items. We took that feedback and then we've built a draft plan around that, and that was released last week. So essentially, as it affects the Northland, this is a map here showing the proposed network. We're improving our service to every half hour between downtown and Antioch Crossing. Antioch Crossing is a hub that we have near Antioch and Vivian. Right now, there are buses hourly, and we're improving that to every 30 minutes by kind of moving a couple of other routes around and combining some routes together and things like that. Notably, we're expanding flex coverage further to the east to serve some areas of need within Kansas City, Missouri, where we've long known that there's some need, but we've never really had successful fixed route service in that area. And then peak hour express buses between Boardwalk Square and downtown. That's something that we currently have a service there, but it's very slow, serves a lot of local stops. And then importantly for North Kansas City, we want to take our 229 downtown to KCI route that currently runs on 169 and actually bring it on Burlington. So North Kansas City would have a direct connection to the airport on that particular route. So that would be a big benefit for North Kansas City. So this plan is a budget neutral plan. So these improvements do come with some reductions and eliminations. So there are a couple of routes in the north end and in the south that are eliminated. They have very low ridership, where we think that service is better allocated to stronger corridors. That's all I have. I will mention the website for this plan, ridekcnext.org. There's a survey up that we encourage you to take, both asking some high-level questions and also some detailed information if you're interested in a particular route. So at this point, take any questions on either topic.
Go ahead, Jim.
I have a couple of questions, about 3 questions regarding this. When you were talking about your budget neutral plan, about route combinations or you were talking about combining routes. You said right now we don't pay for the 201. We have the 235, 233, the flex service. Would the 233, 235, would those be affected?
The 235 would be affected. The 235 would be eliminated in this process. Now, the 235 is unique in that, and I don't know the history of why this exists, but you're not actually paying for the mileage and hours on the 235. It's a $500 flat fee per year. I don't know why, but that's the way it is in the contract. That route would be eliminated.
For each route or for each bus that runs? Or?
For that whole route.
Wow.
In your contract.
Because the 235, it was encompassed like the old 232 or the 132 route as well. So it hits the neighborhoods. Yeah. But would a bus still hit those neighborhoods up north, further north then, or no?
No, and that route only operates early morning and late. It only
Right, peak
operates in rush hours, yeah. So
What
essentially, we're covering that area with a flex zone.
with the flex? And what would be coming down Arbor Road? What would our routes be? The 233 and,
Yeah, so the 238 would still exist, very similar to as it exists now. The 233 will still exist, but we're actually combining that with a couple of other routes that are outside of the city. The service within North Kansas City would be roughly the same.
roughly the same?
At least on the map, we're calling that the 239.
Okay.
Essentially reflecting that we're combining a couple of other routes together in the northwest part of the area.
Okay. Another question I had is, we just, I think we recently renewed a contract for, it was like 6 months. And that's probably the reason why you were doing the contract, obviously, is to get these studies out of the way. When is our do you know when our contract is up, Eric?
The next 6-month period will be July 1st to December 31st.
Okay. And does the city at this time, I know that the KCATA has a program where if a bus is missed or if you have a complaint or an issue, you can call the KCATA. And I've called that before. Quite frankly, sometimes it's difficult to get your complaint logged or anything to be done about the complaint. Do we as a city, like with our contract, because city funds are paying for this service, do we have any kind of mechanism where complaints are stored or can be stored with the city? I know with our trash hauler that, if they miss a pickup and they don't rectify it, that they get charged a fee. So, I'm just wondering if that's something that we can't translate over here. I don't know if that's a question for city staff.
If you have some suggestions for contractual changes that you would like to see considered in the next 6-month it's not part of the current one.
Right.
But if you had some, you wanted to present them to me, we could have that discussion with the KCATA staff.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. A lot of good stuff there. Couple questions from me. First off, like what you're talking about going from 30 to 15 minutes on some of these. What's the margin of error typically on these? Because I would think if I was going to take a bus and I show up there, like how long of a window am I expecting on my every 15 or every 30-minute pickup?
Well, the goal is to be on time, obviously. Our goal on-time performance in the system is 90%. And that's essentially within 5 minutes of being late is considered on time statistically in the transit industry.
Okay.
Being able to speed up the route by reducing the number of stops improves your reliability by essentially being faster and assigning more layover time to the driver at the end of the route, which acts as a good cushion if you end up with a lot of traffic or something like that. You have more time to catch up. So there are some benefits of doing that.
Second question, the stops in North Kansas City, they're obviously all in Burlington, but it looks like 10th, 14th, 16th, Armour, 26th, and 32nd. How were those determined specifically? Because they don't seem to line up necessarily with the population center of North Kansas City.
Those were actually determined as part of our Burlington project. We decided in coordination with KCATA where those stops were going to be located. We were trying to do some consolidation because right now I think we might be a section where there's a stop almost every block. But that was driven by the Burlington corridor plan.
Okay. I saw like the largest cost center was those enhanced stops. If we're looking at, stops, I'm just concerned with the rationale of 10th, 14th, 16th. I know people might be coming to work on those spots, but the population is mostly going to be quite a few blocks off of the route. So how are we going to get riders to Burlington for that route?
So we do have the services on Armour, the 233 that becomes the 239 that will help with that.
So that would be a feeder into.
Yeah, exactly. Serves as a feeder from the east. We do see that when you improve a route to 15-minute frequency, add the nice stations, it does entice people to walk further. People will walk further to a better, faster service. And so we hope that there's some amount of that as well.
Can I ask a dumb question? Who owns the buses and all that? Is this a private thing or is that a city thing or? Who owns the buses?
Well, KCATA, we're a bi-state authority, a public authority.
Okay, well, now, what's going to happen if the Kansas City, Missouri decides they want to have a free buses?
We're working with the city on the details of that. We can't really discuss that any further at this point. There are detailed discussions going on with them to see exactly what that looks like. Yeah.
Well, there's no consideration with this plan here on the money, the operation costs. When Kansas City does go to a free service, of course, it's not free, somebody's gonna pay, and it's gonna be the taxpayer. Is that gonna affect what we pay?
No, no, it will not. Essentially, the fares that we receive are credited to each city within that contract. So there's a line item in your contract where you get a credit for the amount of fares that we collect within North Kansas City, and that wouldn't change.
But are you gonna be collecting fares?
Well, again, depending on details, that would be within Kansas City, Missouri.
I had some questions on, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It's very good information. And I do believe this is important, and it sounds like you've got some good ideas about how to sort of handle that corridor all the way north. So that's good information. I had some questions about how do you decide, and maybe you said this and I missed it, but how are the funds allocated, the expenses allocated? I mean, do you use population or do you use stops, or how did you decide?
It's based on our costs are based on the hours and the miles. So the hours are more closely tied to the labor costs of our drivers, and then the mileage.
I mean, on the city, if you can allocate, or go back a little bit and show the allocation.
Oh, you're talking about on the
Gladstone.
plan. Okay.
Yeah, so I
I'm sorry.
appreciated the credit that you guys were talking about, and I'm a supporter of any public funding that you can get by FYI. But on North Kansas City, so you have a credit that you're talking about because of the work we're doing on Burlington.
Yes,
which is
that's right.
great. But then I'm curious about how is the capital cost, how are those allocated? Because Gladstone has a significantly higher population than we do, so I'm trying to.
They're based on they're based on this map. So essentially taking the stops on this map, and X number of stops are in North Kansas City, X number of stops are in
Oh,
Gladstone.
okay, so it's really just by.
And we have
state.
a cost per stop, and essentially applying that.
Okay, so it doesn't really take into account how many people might use.
No,
the
it's based on the
service
actual
from that.
anticipated costs of that
So
infrastructure.
if you reduce stops, you reduce your allocation, in a
Yes.
sense. Not that I'm advocating reducing stops, but that's how you would affect your allocation. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, and the operating cost side of that, it's based on the miles and hours that operate within each city. So when we do our scheduling, we're able to isolate this many hours on this route operates within North Kansas City,
Oh,
and this
okay.
many miles, and then the cost is a direct outcome of those
Okay,
numbers.
so your percentage, I guess, of the route, in a sense, your 10% or 8% or whatever.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And then again, for you guys, you're paying half of that cost. It's 50% of the miles and hours of those routes.
Have you talked to the other city councils?
Yes, did the same presentation to Gladstone last week. The Kansas City side is a little bit different. We've been working more at the staff level and working with them on the different committees we need to meet with to get this in front of them. I say each city has been very supportive at the staff level, and yes.
Okay, thank you.
I just have a question. On the enhanced stations, will they be digital? Will they be, unlike, just having the sign?
Our plan is for these level of improvements to include our digital touchscreen signage at our max level stations from this point forward, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, one more. So what would be the difference in service between kind of what we're considering in the max? You might have answered this, but what is max level service?
In terms of how often buses run?
Yeah,
or-
is that just 15 minutes?
So right now, our max routes run every 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
So this one wouldn't quite get to that level, and maybe it could in the longer term. But we do think it's important to be able to expand the Max brand, and 15 minutes through transit research tends to be the level of which people don't really need to consult a schedule. You just kind of go to the street and you're gonna, a bus is gonna come by pretty soon. That tends to be where you see a big increase in ridership, is when you make that jump from 30 minutes to 15 minutes.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the presentation.
Well, there is a route that goes up by the hospital. Is that,
It's a 233, and that would continue.
yeah.
Yeah, and actually, there'd be even more service on that.
Yeah, that seems like it's awful busy most of the time, yeah.
It doesn't go right up by the hospital, it goes to the entrance of the road up. But the 235 is the one that you're thinking about that goes through the hospital. And that's the one that's going to get cut.
No, we don't have a fixed route that goes right up to the hospital.
The 235, good evening, everybody.
Yes,
Don Bolin,
yes, it
KCATA. The 233 currently goes to the west of the hospital on the outer road, and then the 235 currently goes to the east, kind of splits Cerner over there.
Oh,
And then we have the flex service that goes up into the hospital.
Okay, is anything else?
May I ask a couple of questions, Mr. Mayor? Thank you.
If you're good.
I'll try. A couple of questions, John Shunda, I was just wondering. So going forward, will all three jurisdictions need to agree for this to move forward?
To be able to expand the service, yes,
Okay.
yes.
And so looking at your Phase 1 improvements then, do I take it then at some point you'll be coming back to the city with your refined Phase 1 improvements?
Yes,
And-
at direction of staff, yes. I can
And-
certainly come back with detailed.
Well, whenever you're
Yes.
ready, let us know. And then at that time, I take it right now, you're not willing to indicate what a North Kansas City cost for Phase 1 improvements might be, but you would at that time, or?
Yes, there are enough factors that I think we would want to talk through before we kind of throw a number out. So I'd want to make sure we're on the same page of what the goals are and decide on some of those factors. I don't want to give you a number now and then it ends up being wildly different.
Thank you.
It'll be substantially less than the 240,000 or whatever. I mean, it'd be, less than half of that essentially, based on the amount of service increase.
Any idea when that might be? When we might hear back from you?
I could come back soon, I mean, in the next month or two.
Oh, well, I wasn't rushing you, but
Okay, I mean, no, I mean,
I assumed it would take
The-
a while for you to continue.
the operating costs, I mean, the more difficult part that takes more time is kind of coming up with the agreements between the three cities to move forward. In terms of what the operating costs are, those are, I shouldn't say easy, it takes some, technical time on our part, but we can nail those down fairly easily. The capital costs are a little more difficult, but the operating, I mean, we know what we pay the drivers, we know how much we pay for fuel and that sort of thing. So,
Well, I think that would be, for you to determine what that would be for our city so that the council could consider it would be, an important thing before we would have you back.
okay, and we would be ready to do that again next month or two. We can move fairly quickly, yep.
You use the same allocation method for operating costs as you do for capital expenses, so it's by stop?
The operating costs are based on the miles and hours that operate within the city. Yeah, the capital cost is based on the actual stop locations and how many there are in
Ah,
the city.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
move to adjourn.
Thank you very much. Move to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?